June 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The first trainloads of German prisoners of war arriving from North Africa were about to witness a phenomenon that would fundamentally undermine all their previous conceptions about the world. These were veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, captured after the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia, where approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms before the Allies on May 13, 1943. What they saw in America over the next 3 years would irrevocably shatter every tenet of Nazi propaganda about American society. While the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, established on the initiative of President Franklin D. Roosevelt on November 3, 1944, documented the physical destruction in Germany, a parallel transformation was taking place in the minds of the 371,683 German POWs held in camps across America. These men became witnesses to the industrial potential that made the Allied victory inevitable. Their journey to the American camps began in the ports of North Africa. At processing centers in Oran and Casablanca, the German prisoners encountered American organizational efficiency for the first time. The U.S. Army processed thousands of men daily with a precision that surpassed the capabilities of the Wehrmacht even at the height of its power. Medical examinations, identity verification, briefings on the Geneva Convention, everything was carried out with systematic efficiency. But what made the strongest impression on the prisoners was the food. After months of desert warfare on meager rations, they suddenly had access to white bread, real coffee, and meat twice a day. This was not special treatment for propaganda purposes. This was the standard U.S. Army ration. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic were themselves a demonstration of American industrial might. Liberty ships, mass-produced at an unprecedented rate, transported the prisoners to America. Although the famous case of the SS Robert E. Peary being assembled in 4 days and 15.5 hours was a carefully orchestrated public relations stunt with extensive prefabrication, the average production time of 39 to 42 days in 1943-1944 still represented remarkable efficiency compared to German shipbuilding capabilities, which required months to build similar vessels. During the 2-week Atlantic crossing, the prisoners observed casual waste that revealed abundance. American sailors discarded half-eaten portions that exceeded the German military ration. The ships themselves, equipped with radar and modern navigation equipment, represented technology that Germany considered experimental, yet here it was used as standard equipment on cargo vessels. Arrival at American ports, Norfolk, Boston, and New York, became for the prisoners a confrontation with an industrial landscape that defied all their expectations. The Norfolk Naval Base alone sprawled across 4,300 acres, with simultaneous construction and repair operations that dwarfed German naval facilities. The prisoners counted dozens of ships in various stages of construction or repair, observing in a single day operations that exceeded the capacity of the largest German ports. The railroad journey to the prisoner of war camps dealt the most crushing blow to Nazi propaganda about American weakness. Unlike the cattle cars used to transport German troops, the prisoners traveled in passenger coaches with seats, dining facilities, and even sleeping berths in some cases. Through the windows, they observed an electrified nation. Every small town blazed with electric lights. Rural areas that in Germany would have been in complete darkness glowed with illumination from farmhouses and barns. Factories operated on night shifts with parking lots full of workers' personal automobiles, a sight impossible in Germany, where car ownership remained a privilege of the elite. Part 2. The Architecture of Abundance. Camps as a microcosm of American society. The prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States became, for the German soldiers, a living demonstration of American organizational genius and resource abundance. The camp system, created by the Prisoner of War Division of the War Department, was a grand logistical project, comparable in scale to the deployment of a field army. In just 90 days, the standard construction cycle, fully fledged settlements with all the necessary infrastructure would spring up from empty fields. The United States held 371,183 German prisoners of war in more than 500 camps located across 46 states. The camps ranged from small facilities for 250 people to giant complexes like Camp Fanning in Texas, which housed up to 12,000 prisoners. Wooden barracks, built to standardized designs, were equipped with electric lighting, hot and cold running water, central heating, and sewer systems. For many prisoners, especially those from rural areas of Germany, these conditions surpassed their pre-war standard of living. Medical care in the camps was a revelatory shock for the Germans. Hospital complexes, such as those at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, or Fort Robinson, Nebraska, were equipped with modern X-ray equipment, surgical wards, and fully stocked pharmacies. American doctors used penicillin freely, a drug that remained in short supply in Germany, even for the seriously wounded. Systematic medical checkups, dental care, and treatment for chronic conditions all demonstrated resources that Germany could not provide even for its own soldiers at the front. The psychological impact of food abundance proved particularly destructive to a worldview formed under conditions of total war and strict austerity. The camp kitchens operated like highly efficient catering enterprises. Refrigeration units, unknown in most German institutions, preserved fresh meat and vegetables. Electric mixers, dishwashers, and gas stoves capable of feeding thousands operated continuously. The daily diet included fresh milk, eggs, meat, and vegetables in quantities that exceeded what German civilians had seen since before the war. Regulations required the preparation of 10% more food than necessary to ensure sufficient portions for all. The resulting surplus was simply thrown away, causing psychological discomfort among prisoners from a country where every crumb of bread was counted. Many Germans secretly collected the discarded food, unable to come to terms with such wastefulness, even when they were full. By the autumn of 1943, labor shortages in the American economy led to the organization of prisoner labor programs. This program, economically necessary for the United States, provided German prisoners with unprecedented access to American industrial and agricultural methods. Working on farms in the Midwest, in the food processing industry in California, or in logging in the Northwest, they witnessed technologies and organizational models that revolutionized their understanding of productivity. In agriculture, the prisoners encountered a level of mechanization that surpassed all German conceptions. Individual farms in Iowa or Nebraska encompassed more acres than entire German villages. Tractors, combines, and other machinery allowed a single farmer to cultivate hundreds of acres. Hybrid corn, developed through American agricultural research, yielded double the harvest compared to traditional varieties. Chemical fertilizers, which Germany desperately needed for explosives production, were used here in abundance for agriculture. Part 3. The Production Machine. Witnesses to an industrial miracle. German prisoners of war who worked at industrial sites became involuntary witnesses to production capacities that made the Allied victory a mathematical inevitability. Their access to plants and factories was limited. They could not work directly on military production, but even peripheral observations revealed the scale of the American Industrial Revolution. In Detroit and its surroundings, the prisoners saw concentrated industrial power that surpassed all of Germany. Factory complexes stretching for miles operated in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Automobile plants converted for war production demonstrated a flexibility unattainable for German industry. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, prisoners could observe how assembly lines that previously produced civilian automobiles were now outputting M4 Sherman tanks at a rate of up to 900 units per month, more than the entire monthly tank production of Germany in 1942. The Ford Willow Run plant became for many prisoners the symbol of American production might. Visible from miles away, this gigantic complex produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a staggering speed. In April 1944, the plant reached peak production, one fully assembled bomber every 63 minutes. Although this exceptional rate was not sustained consistently, the very possibility of such production demonstrated capabilities that German aircraft manufacturers could not achieve even for simple fighter planes. German engineers among the prisoners documented American mass production methods with astonishment. Instead of the German approach based on craftsmanship and individual fitting of parts, the Americans used standardization and interchangeability. Parts manufactured in different plants across different states fit together perfectly without additional machining. A system of tolerances and calibrations ensured uniformity impossible in German production. Quality control systems were of particular interest to the technically trained prisoners. Instead of selective inspection of finished products, the Americans used statistical process control methods. Every worker was responsible for the quality of their operation, and built-in inspection systems identified defects at early stages. This approach ensured consistently high product quality despite enormous production volumes and the use of unskilled labor. The electrification of American industry made a particularly strong impression on prisoners from a country where energy resources were strictly rationed. Individual plants, such as the aluminum smelter in Tennessee, consumed more electricity than entire German cities. Projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority demonstrated the scale of energy infrastructure that Germany had never attempted to create. The Hoover Dam generated more electricity than several of the largest German power plants combined. This energy abundance made continuous industrial production possible. Three-shift factory operations and the electrification of the entire production process created output rates unattainable for German industry, which faced constant disruptions in energy supply. In food processing plants, prisoners observed automation that challenged German industrial understanding. Canning factories in California and New Jersey processed volumes that would have required hundreds of workers in Germany. Automatic filling machines, electric conveyor systems, and quality control procedures operated with minimal staff, as American workers served in the military. Nevertheless, production exceeded pre-war levels due to efficiency and mechanization. Part 4. The Agricultural Revolution. Abundance as the norm. For the German prisoners of war, who had grown up in conditions of limited land resources and traditional farming methods, encountering the American agricultural system was a revelation comparable to their industrial discoveries. Working on farms across the Midwest and the Great Plains, they encountered an agricultural model based on mechanization, science, and scale that was radically different from anything they had known. The sheer size of American farms stretched their imagination. Individual farms in Iowa, Nebraska, or Kansas occupied areas larger than the territories of entire German villages. A typical farm of 400–500 acres was considered a medium-sized operation, whereas in Germany, even 50 acres represented a significant holding. This difference in scale determined all other aspects of agricultural production. Mechanization was the most visible distinction. The German prisoners, accustomed to manual labor and the use of horses, watched in amazement as a single farmer with a tractor and a set of farm machinery could cultivate areas that would have required dozens of workers in Germany. Combines that simultaneously reaped and threshed grain, beet harvesters, potato planters, every operation was mechanized. On many farms, the prisoners saw arrays of agricultural machinery whose value exceeded that of the entire estate of a German landowner. The scientific approach to agriculture demonstrated the systemic advantage of the American model. Plant breeding programs at agricultural colleges produced continuously improving varieties. Hybrid corn, developed in the 1930s, doubled yields compared to traditional varieties. Soil mapping, regular soil analysis, and scientifically informed fertilizer application, all this was standard practice even on average farms. Chemical fertilizers, which in Germany were a strategic resource directed primarily toward the war effort, were used here in abundance. The prisoners saw farmers purchasing tons of synthetic fertilizers produced in plants that, before the war, had manufactured explosives. Insecticides and fungicides, many developed during military research, protected crops from pests and diseases. The electrification of rural areas made a particularly strong impression on the prisoners. By 1943, over 90% of American farms had electricity, while in Germany the figure was less than 20%. Electric motors powered threshers, water pumps, and milking machines. Refrigeration equipment allowed for the storage of perishable goods. Radio brought information about market prices and weather forecasts. The system of agricultural education and knowledge dissemination demonstrated the advantages of a democratic approach. Farmers regularly attended lectures by specialists from agricultural colleges, read specialized publications, and participated in cooperative programs. Knowledge was not the privilege of an elite, as it was in Germany, but was freely disseminated among all producers. Livestock farming was also striking in its scale and efficiency. Beef cattle breeds, developed for maximum weight gain, were kept on feedlots where thousands of head received a balanced diet. Dairy farms with mechanized milking systems produced milk at a level of productivity unattainable for German operations. Food processing and storage completed the picture of agrarian abundance. Grain elevators holding millions of bushels, canning factories processing thousands of tons of vegetables and fruit, cold storage warehouses preserving meat for months. All this infrastructure ensured an uninterrupted supply for the population and the army. For the German prisoners of war, many of whom came from rural backgrounds, these observations held particular significance. They saw that American agriculture did not merely produce enough food for its population, it created surpluses that could feed its allies and even aid its enemy. This level of productivity, achieved while less than 20% of the population was engaged in agriculture, compared to 30% in Germany, demonstrated the fundamental superiority of the American economic model. Part 5. The Social Laboratory, Re-education and Ideological Transformation. The prisoner of war camps became not just places of internment, but unique social laboratories where ideologies and values clashed. The American authorities, who initially viewed the prisoners from a purely practical standpoint, gradually recognized the camp's potential as a tool for ideological influence. Thus, one of the most ambitious and controversial programs was born: the systematic re-education of German prisoners of war. The Secret Special Projects Division under Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davidson began its work in late 1943. Its mission was unprecedented: to transform Nazi soldiers into citizens of a democratic Germany who could assist in post-war reconstruction. The program was based on a careful classification of the prisoners: anti-Nazis, about 10%, apolitical, 75–80%, and committed Nazis, 10–15%. The main focus was on the middle group, which constituted the vast majority. The re-education methods were psychologically sophisticated. Instead of direct propaganda, subtle influence through various channels was used. Camp libraries received carefully curated literature in German, classic works, historical texts, books on philosophy and political science. Newspapers and magazines available to the prisoners presented diverse viewpoints, which in itself was revolutionary for people raised under Nazi censorship. Educational programs became a key element of the transformation. By 1944, approximately 25,000 prisoners had completed formal courses in English, American history, economics, and the fundamentals of democracy. Instructors from American universities delivered lectures through a correspondence study system. Particular attention was paid to practical aspects: how labor unions function, how local government works, how civil rights are protected. Camp newspapers, published by the prisoners themselves, became a barometer of ideological change. By 1945, 135 different newspapers were being published in the camps. Publications that began with nationalistic and oppositional sentiments gradually evolved towards discussions of post-war reconstruction and democratic principles. The newspaper Der Ruf, The Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, and distributed to all camps, became the most important platform for anti-Nazi prisoners. Religious life in the camps offered an alternative value system to Nazism. Chaplains held services in German, local church congregations donated religious literature and organized concerts of sacred music. For many prisoners who had grown up under Nazi pressure on religious institutions, this was a return to traditional Christian values. Attendance at religious services in some camps exceeded 60%. The celebration of Christmas in 1943 had a particularly profound psychological impact. American religious and civic organizations sent gifts to the camps for the German prisoners, enemies whose country was still at war with America. Churches organized Christmas services in German. Local communities donated food for festive meals. This treatment of enemies demonstrated not weakness, but the highest degree of confidence in their own righteousness and strength. Cultural events became another channel of influence. Screenings of American films, including critical works like The Grapes of Wrath, showed the prisoners that a democratic society was capable of self-criticism and open discussion of its problems. Sports competitions between camps, theatrical performances, and musical evenings all created an atmosphere of normal life that contrasted with the militaristic rigidity of Nazi Germany. Camp psychologists documented the gradual transformation in the prisoners' consciousness. Many exhibited symptoms of what would later be termed ideological collapse syndrome: withdrawal from political discussions, rejection of previously held beliefs, and interest in alternative systems of thought. Even prisoners who maintained German patriotism often abandoned Nazi ideology when confronted with evidence that contradicted it. Relations with the local population became perhaps the most powerful tool of transformation. Prisoners who worked on farms often shared meals with American families. Those who labored in industrial enterprises worked side by side with American civilian workers. These human contacts refuted Nazi propaganda more effectively than any formal program. Many prisoners maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. Part 6. The Infrastructure of Abundance: Technology and Organization as the Foundation of Superiority. The German prisoners of war witnessed a technological and organizational power that manifested in every detail of American life. What was considered a luxury or cutting-edge technology in Germany was standard and commonplace in the United States. This fundamental difference in the technological base became evident in the most varied aspects, from domestic comforts to grand infrastructure projects. The electrification of the country made perhaps the strongest impression on the prisoners. While even major cities in Germany faced power supply interruptions, and rural areas often had no access to electricity at all, in America, electricity was ubiquitous. Farmhouses in the backcountry had full electric lighting, water pumping stations, and household appliances. Prisoners worked on Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA projects, a colossal undertaking that alone provided more electricity than all of Germany before the war. The transportation infrastructure demonstrated a scale unattainable for Europe. Railway networks with automatic signaling and centralized traffic control allowed for the efficient movement of enormous volumes of freight. The system of highways, including the nascent interstate highway system, bound the country into a single economic space. Prisoners who worked on railway maintenance saw sophisticated control systems that ensured uninterrupted traffic flow with minimal staff. Communication and information technology were a separate source of astonishment. The telephone network covered the entire country. Ordinary Americans could call the other end of the continent. Radio broadcasting ensured the instant dissemination of information. Postal services delivered mail across the entire country in a matter of days. For prisoners from a country where even postal censorship caused delays, this speed of communication was astounding. Civil engineering and architecture demonstrated a different approach to planning and resources. Prisoner of war camps were built in 90 days, including water supply, sewerage, and power systems. In Germany, comparable projects would have taken years. The use of standardized designs, prefabricated components, and assembly line methods in construction showed that the American production approach was applied across all industries. Sanitation and public health were areas where the differences were particularly stark. Modern water treatment and sewage systems were deployed in the camps. Regular medical checkups, vaccinations, and dental care were routine. The use of penicillin, in Germany this antibiotic was scarce even for wounded officers, was employed here on a mass scale. Psychiatric care, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was available to prisoners with combat stress. The educational infrastructure was striking in its scope and accessibility. Prisoners saw how farmers' children attended modern schools equipped with laboratories and libraries. The land-grant college system provided higher education for broad segments of the population. Vocational training programs and night schools allowed workers to improve their qualifications. This investment in human capital was unprecedented for the German observers. The financial system demonstrated a sophistication unattainable for Germany. Farmers received loans to buy machinery, workers to acquire housing. The system of mortgage lending, consumer credit, and insurance products created an economic mobility impossible in the more rigid German system. Prisoners learned about concepts like personal finance management, investing, and retirement planning, topics largely unknown to most Germans. The scientific research infrastructure manifested in the most unexpected places. Agricultural experiment stations, industrial research laboratories, university research centers, all worked in close connection with practical needs. Prisoners with technical training were amazed at how quickly scientific discoveries found practical application, from hybrid corn to new production processes. Management and administration demonstrated an efficiency that challenged Nazi conceptions of democracy as an ineffective system. The camps were run with minimal staff, decisions were made quickly, and bureaucracy was kept to a minimum. Prisoners saw how American sergeants managed complex operations with an initiative and responsibility that in Germany would only have been possible for senior officers. Civil society and volunteer organizations showed a different approach to social organization. The YMCA, the Red Cross, church groups, civic associations, all of them worked with the prisoners, demonstrating that society could organize itself from the bottom up without state coercion. For people raised in a totalitarian state, where all organizations were under the control of the Nazi Party, this was a revolutionary discovery. The environmental and resource base evoked a mixture of envy and despair. Forest resources, which were carefully conserved in Germany, seemed limitless here. Oil fields, coal mines, and metallurgical plants operated at full capacity, with no signs of shortage. The prisoners understood that America was waging war not by conserving resources, but by increasing their production. Part 7. The Human Dimension. Informal contacts and moral transformation. Beyond the formal re-education programs and organized events, perhaps the most profound transformation occurred through personal contacts and direct observation of American society. These informal interactions often had a stronger impact than any planned ideological interventions. The relationships between prisoners and American guards became the first channel of such influence. Unlike the strict hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, American servicemen maintained relatively informal relations with the prisoners. Guards often shared cigarettes with prisoners, discussed sporting events, and showed photographs of their families. This human dimension contradicted Nazi propaganda that depicted Americans as culturally inferior. Work on farms provided particularly rich opportunities for intercultural exchange. German prisoners, many of whom were farmers themselves, worked side by side with American families. They planted and harvested crops together, repaired machinery, and tended to livestock. Around the dinner table, they discussed farming methods, family traditions, and future plans. For many prisoners, these simple human interactions were a revelation. They saw that their enemies shared the same daily concerns and joys. In industrial regions, prisoners worked alongside American workers, including women and African Americans. This site challenged several Nazi dogmas at once. Women performed complex technical work that in Germany was considered exclusively male. African Americans held positions of responsibility, operated complex equipment, and sometimes trained white workers, scenes impossible within the Nazi racial hierarchy. Religious interactions had a deep moral impact. Local pastors and priests regularly visited the camps, held services in German, and brought religious literature. For many prisoners who had grown up under Nazi pressure on Christian churches, this was a return to spiritual roots. It made a particular impression that American religious leaders treated German prisoners as brothers in faith, not as enemies. Educational exchanges happened spontaneously and naturally. American farmers explained the principles of agricultural machinery to prisoners. Local teachers helped with learning English. Engineers discussed technical innovations. These knowledge transfer sessions were mutually beneficial. The prisoners gained new skills, and the Americans gained additional labor and sometimes technical insights from experienced German specialists. Cultural exchange occurred through various channels. Prisoners introduced Americans to German music and poetry. Americans in turn shared their cultural traditions. Joint celebrations of Christmas, birthdays, and local festivals created a sense of shared humanity that destroyed propaganda stereotypes on both sides. The American attitude toward the prisoners as individuals, not just as representatives of a hostile nation, had a particular psychological impact. Guards and civilian workers remembered prisoners' names, inquired about their fates, and helped them contact their families in Germany. For people raised in a totalitarian system where individuality was subordinated to the state, such personal attention was a revelation. Economic interactions also carried an ideological load. Prisoners received payment for their work, albeit in special camp currency, could buy goods in camp stores, and could save money. They saw how the American system encouraged individual initiative and entrepreneurship even during wartime, a contrast to the German war economy based on centralized planning and coercion. Medical care was perhaps the most powerful demonstration of American values. German doctors among the prisoners worked alongside American colleagues, gaining access to advanced medical technologies and drugs. They saw how the American system treated the health of prisoners with the same seriousness as that of its own citizens. The treatment of psychological trauma made a particular impression. In the Wehrmacht, such conditions were often seen as a sign of weakness. Sporting events created a space for healthy competition and mutual respect. Soccer matches between prisoners and local teams, baseball games, and track and field competitions all helped break down barriers and build relationships based on shared interests and respect for skill. Correspondence with American families became an important channel for long-term influence. Many prisoners maintained contacts with the farmers and workers they had met during captivity. These letters, sometimes continuing for decades, allowed them to observe the post-war development of both countries through the prism of personal relationships. For many prisoners, the most shocking realization was that American abundance was not for show or reserved only for the elite. They saw that ordinary workers and farmers lived in conditions that in Germany would have been the privilege of the upper classes. This democratic character of prosperity undermined the very foundation of Nazi ideology, which was based on the idea of racial and social inequality. Part 8. The Legacy of the Experience. From Enemies to Architects of a New World. The phenomenon of German prisoners of war in America left a deep and multifaceted legacy that continued to influence the post-war world long after the last prisoners returned to Germany in 1946-1947. Their experience became a bridge between two nations that had recently been mortal enemies and laid the foundation for one of the most successful transformations in modern history. The return of the prisoners to post-war Germany was a crucial moment for the transfer of knowledge and values. These men did not return empty-handed. They brought with them technical expertise, managerial approaches, and, perhaps most importantly, a new worldview. In a country lying in ruins, where traditional social and political structures had collapsed, their experience became a valuable resource for reconstruction. The West German economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, relied significantly on the knowledge and approaches brought back by former prisoners of war. They became conduits for American management methods, quality control systems, and approaches to labor productivity. German companies rebuilding after the war actively implemented principles these men had observed in American factories: standardization, assembly line methods, and statistical quality control. Agricultural transformation became one of the most visible areas of influence. Former prisoners who had worked on American farms became active advocates for mechanization and scientific farming methods. They argued for the consolidation of land plots, the introduction of modern machinery, and the use of chemical fertilizers and hybrid seeds. Their hands-on experience with American agricultural technology made them valuable consultants in modernization programs. Political influence manifested in the active participation of former prisoners in building West German democracy. Many of them assumed positions in local government, educational institutions, and civic associations. Their understanding of the American political system, acquired through educational programs in the camps, helped shape stable democratic institutions in post-war Germany. The role of former prisoners in shaping transatlantic relations was particularly significant. These men, with direct experience of life in America, became natural intermediaries between the two cultures. They could explain American approaches and values to their compatriots while simultaneously helping Americans understand the German perspective. This role became especially important at the beginning of the Cold War, when West Germany became a key ally of the United States. The educational and professional trajectories of many former prisoners demonstrate the long-term impact of their experience. Some, like Walter Hallstein, who organized a camp university in Mississippi, later became prominent political figures. Hallstein became the first president of the European Commission. Others used the professional skills acquired in America to build successful careers in business, engineering, and education. The Marshall Plan, beginning in 1947, found fertile ground prepared by the experience of former prisoners of war. These men understood American methods and approaches. They could work effectively with American advisors, translating not just language but concepts. Their role as cultural intermediaries significantly accelerated the implementation of aid programs and contributed to their success. The religious revival in post-war Germany was also influenced by the returning prisoners. Many of them, having rediscovered Christian values in the American camps, became active members of church communities. Their experience of interacting with American religious organizations that treated them with compassion, despite their status as enemies, became powerful testimony to the strength of religious reconciliation. At the local community level, former prisoners often initiated sister city programs between German and American towns. Their personal contacts, established during captivity, evolved into official partnerships promoting cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Many such connections endure to this day. The psychological legacy of the experience was no less important. These men returned with a deep understanding that prosperity and freedom were not mutually exclusive concepts. They saw that a democratic society could be efficient, that a market economy could create widespread prosperity, and that treating people with dignity produced better results than coercion. Historical revisions in subsequent decades confirmed the significance of this unique experiment. While initial assessments of the re-education program's effectiveness were skeptical, the long-term perspective revealed their profound influence. The most effective lessons were found not in formal courses, but in the everyday experience of living within American society, even within the limited confines of the camp. Modern research shows that regions of Germany with higher concentrations of former POWs demonstrated faster economic growth and more successful democratic consolidation in the post-war years. This correlation suggests that the transfer of knowledge and values had measurable consequences for the country's development. Personal testimonies from former prisoners, collected in numerous memoirs, interviews, and historical studies, paint a picture of deep transformation. These men describe how they arrived in America as convinced Nazis and returned as supporters of democracy, not because they were forced to, but because they saw a system that worked better. In a global historical context, the experience of German prisoners of war in America represents a unique example of successful, soft transformation. Unlike many other cases in history where changes of political regimes were accompanied by violence and coercion, here the change occurred through demonstration and persuasion, through personal experience and human connections. The legacy of this experience continues to live on in German-American relations, in the institutions of the European Union, and in countless personal stories of friendship and cooperation that emerged from the initial confrontation. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest periods of history, building bridges of understanding is possible, and that sometimes the most enduring peace is built not on the terms of the victors, but on shared values and respect for human dignity. The story of German prisoners of war in America is not merely a footnote to World War II, but an important chapter in the creation of the post-war world order. It demonstrates that enemies can become partners, that warriors can become builders, and that witnesses to democracy's success can become its most effective advocates. Ultimately, this transformation, achieved not by force but by example, may have been America's greatest victory in that war.